Anyone who loves books knows the joys of wandering the aisles of a favorite bookstore. But have you ever stopped to think about how a bookstore decides what books to sell? And what, if anything, authors can do to get their books onto those shelves? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and I'm here today with Kate Leahy. So, Kate, I read recently that there are only 16 stores dedicated to just selling cookbooks or books about food and wine across the entire country.
Those are our people.
There's Seattle, San Francisco, there's a couple in New York, but the oldest of these cookbook stores is Kitchen Arts and Letters, and it was founded almost 40 years ago by a gentleman named Knock Waxman. And today on the show, we have Matt Sartwell, who is the managing partner at Kitchen Arts and Letters.
I mean, can you think of a better person to talk about how cookbooks get on a shelf in a bookstore, what the sales team at publishers do, what an author can do to just, give us a little edge to get noticed?
I'm fascinated by the topic, and I think we're going to learn a lot. So let's get to it. Matt Sartwell, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Oh, thank you guys for having me on. I've been listening almost since day one, and it's been sort of a secret goal to get on here. So,
well, I'm glad we were making your goal happen right now.
So. I feel like I made it. Thank you.
Well, we're super excited because we talk a lot about the making of books, but the selling of books is because if we're not selling them, why are we making them? So, but let's go back a little bit because believe it or not, Matt, some people may not have heard of Kitchen Arts and Letters. So if you could just tell us a little bit about your shop, the history, where it is, what makes it special?
Sure. Well, we're located in Manhattan on the Upper East Side in a neighborhood called Carnegie Hill. We've been here almost 40 years. It will be our 40th anniversary this fall in September. We're still working on ways to celebrate that. The store was founded originally by Knock Waxman, who left a career as an editor with a couple of major publishing houses to work for himself. And he thought he really wanted to own a bookstore, and he knew almost immediately that it had to be specialized. And his two choices were things that he was most passionate about. Cooking was one, and sports was the other. But he realized that there were more people who made their living through food, and that there would always be a basis of people who had a need for things that were out of the ordinary. So that's how the store started. I started here in 1991. I had been an editor at Penguin. I found that job was really a little bit too much about bean counting and arguing over marketing budgets. And I was going to go and be a freelance editor. And then a friend of mine heard about an opening here, and I started coming in part-time. And bookselling became that thing that in a way, I had hoped editing would always be, which was about getting an interesting book in the hands of the person who needed it and helping people discover something that they might not even know existed. That fit pretty well with what Knock's mission of the store had always been. So we've been here all that time. Knock passed away almost 2 years ago. Not a day goes by that I don't think to myself, I wish I could ask him what he would think about something like that. But at the same time, he was never shy about his opinion. So it's usually it's easy to conjure up what his take might have been about most things. And now we go along, I think, trusting that we're keeping to the path he would have wanted it.
Yeah.
We bring books in from all over the world. We sometimes get called a cookbook store, but we are really more generally interested in books about food and drink from almost any angle. So books on food history, anthropology, sociology. We have books on opening restaurants, books about food in drama, anything that sort of is in that cloud around the idea of eating and drinking. We consider it fair game.
It's a good distinction, and I'm so glad you made it because I noticed, it says on your website, books about food and drink, they don't have to have recipes. They're not all cookbooks. Certainly a lot of them are, and a lot of periodicals. To me, it's a real source for magazines and other periodicals from all over the world, really.
Yeah, that's true. I think in general, periodical publishing, magazine publishing has become passion projects. There are, of course, the really big players in the field, but we don't even bother to carry them, not because we think anything bad about them, but because you can find them everywhere. So we bring in, there's a funny little magazine on food scholarship that comes from the UK called Petit Propos Culinaire. We carry a magazine out of Denmark called Preserve Journal, which is not about preserving, but about preserving food culture. We just started carrying our first Indian published food magazine. So that's a lot of fun because they're more immediate than books, and they can often incorporate a wider range of voices, and they can expose us to things that we might want to end up carrying in the store. Instagram is a great way to learn about people's projects like that, but sometimes writers are better at writing than they are at social media. And so a written form is a good way for us to learn about things we ought to be carrying.
That segues into one of the points Molly and I wanted to ask you about, which is really how do you find the periodicals and books and things you want to actually carry in the store? How much of a role does, say, the publisher play in that? Or how much of a role is it you seeking out interesting things that you're finding through word of mouth, online, and whatnot?
It's pretty manifold how we end up getting books and magazines. Certainly with the big publishing houses, we have sales reps who call on us or set up video calls and say, here's a season's worth of books and let's go over them. Some houses are better at that than others. There's some places I have to chase down every season. But we're also learning all the time from our customers. We carry some books that we learned about because one of our customers walks in the door and says, I was just in the airport in Jakarta and look what I found. It's a great lead, and we never would have had any idea that there was something out there. So it's always that kind of adventure. My colleagues spend a lot of time paying attention to Instagram and finding things there, and I have to say that's wonderful. And people do write us out of the blue and just say, we're doing this project, would you consider carrying it? We love things like that. We want people who walk in the door here and people who go on our website to say, wow, there are things here I never knew existed. So we work closely with individual publishers, self-publishers.
One thing I wanted to ask is I'm picturing, when I worked in restaurants, wine reps would come in and they'd be wheeling their little cart, which had open bottles of wine that they were tasting at all the restaurants in that neighborhood. I'm guessing people repping books for publishers are not wheeling their little cart of books to show you. And can you tell us just a little bit about how those conversations go? I'm really curious.
Well, traditionally, say we're, dealing with something that comes from a big mainstream publishing house, we no longer get print catalogs. It's all done electronically. And there's a platform called Edelweiss.plus where almost every publisher lists their catalog. And that is something that as an individual, people can sign up for and get access to. They don't get every level of information detail that might be accessible to, say, a bookseller, particularly a bookseller who's working with a sales rep. But you can go on and see what is in the Penguin Random House catalog for the fall. So that's what they give us to work with. The information in that platform, in Edelweiss, is almost exactly what gets fed to the big online booksellers. So it's really not that different from what you would see at barnesandnoble.com or Amazon. Although there are sometimes discussions of comparative sales figures and things like that publishers may be willing to admit to, they can be very shy about actually saying, we sold this many thousand copies of the author's previous book, but sometimes it slips in there. That will not be part of what they feed to Amazon. So that's often what we have. I mean, the same information that as a consumer you might have looking it up online is what we have to make our decisions based on. Occasionally they'll have a digital reading copy available for us to download, but those are often not ready at the time that we're being asked to make order decisions. So we're making our choices on the basis of author reputation, our experience possibly with selling their previous book, on what we think about how interesting the subject matter is. Is this fresh territory? Has there ever been a book about this topic? I mean, publishers often shy away from things like that because they don't have anything to make a comparison to.
Right.
For us, it's often exciting because it's like, wow.
A brand new topic.
Right. We don't have any books on Portuguese baking. And somebody at a publishing house is going to look up past records and say, well, there's never been one. So obviously they don't sell. So it's a very circular argument there.
Yeah.
We actually did at once have a book on Portuguese baking and we sold it like crazy. But
I think this is a hot tip. Anybody who's really interested in baking and has a connection to Portugal, this could be this opening right here.
The world is full of unexplored territory. And it can be hard to get publishers off the dime on those points. Instead they'll suddenly all gang up and decide, like the year when there were 7 pie books in the fall season. I mean, I felt so bad for all those authors because somebody somewhere should have just said, wait.
Too much pie.
Yeah.
Well, that brings up an interesting question about 7 pie books in one season. Anybody who gets a chance to be anywhere near New York City should go into your shop if they haven't already. But it's amazing how many titles you stock in a relatively tight space. But you can't have every book. And so you're curating your stock and you need to make the decision, what books you're going to, and also balancing that with backlist too, because you do carry bestsellers, books that have always sold. So how do you figure out what the mix is?
I have to say, I always feel like I should be more systematic than I am. I go through a publisher's catalog and I say, does this feel like it deserves a chance? Is it going to do something that nothing else is doing? Is it refreshing the way we look at a particular subject? Or is it a subject of perpetual interest? People buy books out of many different motives. Sometimes it's they have a problem to solve. I have a 6-year-old who keeps coming home and saying, I signed you up for the bake sale this weekend and I said you'd bring 6 dozen cookies. And by the way, it's Friday afternoon. So, they're like simple baking books. People will always need something like that. There are books that talk about subjects that are gaining more and more interest. So fermentation, for instance, is a topic that has been steadily building over the last 20, 25 years. And people continue to be interested in that. It's a vast subject. There's so much to say about it. So even though there are some really significant books in the field at this point, you could still come along and do something really, really interesting there. And if somebody we've had a great time with comes along with a new book, I'm going to pay really good attention to that.
Mm-hmm.
I will say I also look pretty closely at what my perception is of how the publisher has thought about the book. If I think that the publisher doesn't understand the book, I'm going to be leery of it.
Can you give us an example of a way a publisher might be positioning a book that you feel like, I just don't think that's right? Like what kinds of things happen?
If the cover isn't clear, if it looks like they have tried to satisfy 15 different people in putting a cover together, that says to me that there's a lack of a coherent understanding in the publisher about what the book is offering. And I can understand that sometimes there's a tension between what somebody who's passionately close to a subject knows about the book and what they want it to be, and what, say, a sales team that has 900 other books in a season wants. Because sometimes the sales team is like, I got a lot of books here. You need to give me, that 1-2 handle. Let me sell this. I don't want to have to explain it too much. But if it's ambiguous and the author's name is tiny and they've had 4 successful books, it says to me that they just don't have a clear sense of where they're going with it. I also look for copy that is perfunctory. The only book you'll ever need about X.
And by copy, for the listeners, it's flap copy or back copy. It's the summary.
Yeah, so often now what you read on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or on many bookstores' websites is just going to be the copy that the publisher has written for it. And it used to be the flap copy, and it often is the same thing that they end up printing. But if that's so unoriginal as to say, the only book you'll ever need, or, every cook will need this book on chicken soup, that says to me that they haven't really thought about what they've got and they don't understand what they've got. So I'm going to pass on that or go very light on that because they just haven't brought much originality to it. It's possible that the author has, and that's one of the tragedies that happens in modern publishing, is that sometimes a great book is not well served by a marketing approach that is very ordinary. But I will not name a name, but I literally had an appointment with a sales rep about 2 weeks ago for one of the big umbrella conglomerates. And they had at least 3 cocktail books that said something along the lines of the only cocktail book you'll ever need. That's just such a lack of thoughtfulness that it makes me just feel like, there are going to be other choices that I can make that are more on message and more thoughtful.
And you already have that background of knowing what a house looks like on the back end. You've worked in publishing and you now are working on and seeing it from the bookseller side. But this is this part that authors, we rarely get a glimpse at this. This is really interesting to know what you're seeing because we don't get to interact with the sales team. If authors got to interact with sales teams, we'd hound them. We'd be sending them free cookies and champagne and like, sell my book, sell my book. So this is really interesting to see sometimes where, things might not quite work out in an author's favor. But what kinds of things can work out? Like, when does a plan work?
I think in most cases, it depends a lot on what we end up hearing from the author. The pressure in publishing houses tends to be so unrelenting. you've got your 30 days, and then the person whose book is coming out behind you is getting the attention of the publicist. And unless it's a giant, massive national media campaign rollout, there's not a lot of support. So I often reevaluate my position on a book when I do hear directly from an author, somebody who says, I'm going to be coming in your way, or I live in your neighborhood, I'd love to do something and work with you. We can't always make that happen. And I will say that for anybody, this is not just about approaching Kitchen Arts and Letters or, the other specialty stores, because there are great stores in other parts of the country, like Now Serving in Los Angeles or Omnivore in San Francisco or Booklarder in Seattle. And there's now Bold Fork in Washington, D.C., which I haven't been to yet. I'd love to get there. So those stores and any independent bookstore is going to have its own way of doing things. And you should, as an author, think about trying to understand them. Look at their website. I mean, I get offers weekly for people who want to come in and do kitchen demos. We don't have a kitchen. And there's nothing on our events page that ever comes close to suggesting that we do that. So when I get an offer like that, it says to me that somebody hasn't paid attention to who we are. So somebody who does look at our website and knows that mostly we partner with offsite institutions like the 92nd Street Y here or the Museum of Food and Drink, then I think to myself, oh, hey, this person's done a little bit of homework that suggests good things about them. Book is probably well thought through too. I'll look a little more deeply. We often can't do much more than invite somebody in to sign stock. We're adding far too many books to do events with somebody all the time, but we do coordinate with people who are setting up events on their own. To use a very famous example, Andrea is doing some events with some Vietnamese-owned businesses here, and we're partnering with her to supply books for that. We offer pretty generous discounts to authors who are setting up their events where they're going to be there, they're going to be talking to people, and they want to handle everything on their own. We'll work with them to make sure that they have books for that event. But it depends a lot on a particular book, how it fits. Some things are very chefy. That's going to require a different kind of audience than a book that's for home cooks. So those can all be pluses. But even if just somebody who writes me a letter and says, I don't have the budget to come to New York, I wish I could, but my book is coming out, and a few things that I wish were in the copy for my book that aren't, that I'd like you to know is, and let me know.
Wow.
Write to me.
That's a great suggestion.
It really is.
Say you're with a traditional publisher and you not just relying on that sales team or that sales rep that's come to visit you. And also if the copy that's on the book or wherever isn't, because the author rarely has any say on that, if at all. I mean, they may not have even seen it until, but if you're not happy with it, it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. You might have to do just some more work on your end.
Right.
It's a different way of talking about it. And I understand that when that copy gets written, the goal may be to seek the largest possible audience.
Yeah.
At a specialty store, we're not necessarily about the largest possible audience, but about the most passionately interested. And so there may be different things to say to those people, or even the best copy has to stop saying things at a certain point. So what got left out? Tell us about that, because we write our own copy for 90% of what's on the website. We don't recycle the publisher's copy.
I mean, this isn't a question. I just want to take a moment to say that, because everybody should look at this website, because we talked about this with Bonnie Benwick. She was on talking about book criticism. And if you start looking and tuning your eye to like what's online, when you Google a title, you'll start to see it's all the same. Most people are just repeating the copy. And what you do at Kitchen Arts and Letter is you write original summary of what the book is about. And it's an incredible resource for anybody looking to find out what's really going on in the book. So like I said, it's not a question, but that's got to take an enormous amount of work on your part. But it goes to that idea that if you're writing a book for everyone, it's for no one. And book copy is often written, as you say, Matt, for the biggest possible audience. And so, one of the things about an independent bookseller is you're finding that one book for that one person and making that match.
I don't want to make this sound like I think I know better than our customers. But people sometimes come in and the question that they start off asking is not the question that they really want to have answered. They anticipate what they think they know is already going to be our response because maybe they've looked online and they've seen things framed a certain way. Most of us have spent time with these books. I mean, even just to write copy about a book, I'll spend not compared to the author, no time at all. But I mean, if I spend 20, 30 minutes with a book, I can go through and I can understand how it's organized, how somebody is talking to people. Are they, is this pitched to somebody who's just getting started, or is it pitched to somebody who's deep in the woods already? And we try to help our customers understand that from our copy. Because the best book in the world for somebody who is really just sort of freshly aware of the possibilities of a certain type of cooking is not going to be the same book for somebody who's been in it a long time and maybe they're feeling a little weary about it and they want to revive their interest. You got to come up with a completely different book for that person. And that's what we try to do with the copy we write. And that's the kind of distinctions I look for when I'm hoping to read good publisher copy.
This is so fascinating. But I want to go just some really sort of basic nuts and bolts in terms of ordering and stocking. And how do stores work with publishers? Like just sort of how books move around.
Okay, well, big distinction between front list, the new books, and backlist. So with the front list, most of the publishers have a minimum total number of units in an order, but I could order one copy of 25 different books
and
hit that minimum, or I could order 25 copies of one book and hit that minimum. They're pretty flexible about that. I, generally speaking, if I'm really interested in the book, I'm going to try to come in at a level of 10 to 12 copies. I could go more. I mean, if the sales rep comes in and says, "Hey, I've got the new Deb Perlman Spit and Kitchen dessert book," it's going to be a lot more than that. But if it's somebody I don't know, but I think, oh, that's worth a try, usually having that number of copies is going to mean they can come in, we can get a look at it. If it starts to find customers, we're going to have the chance to reorder it and get it back in. I place those orders with publishers, the front list orders, usually 3 times a year. Most publishers work on a 3-season basis. For some houses, I'm already ordering for fall 2023, but that also means that in many cases they haven't even shown me a cover, which is not my favorite way of doing it, but it is what it is. For backlist, or even things that we've gotten our initial order, I can go back to the publisher. Most publishers, again, are pretty flexible about that. They want you to be coming back to reorder. And some publishers I order from weekly, sometimes it's once a month. It really depends. They may not have that many new books in a season, but if one of them takes off, I'll be back to them quickly. How quickly we get the books depends partly on where their warehouses are. Mm-hmm. There are 3 or 4 publishers who have warehouses within one-day UPS delivery of New York City. So we're lucky that way. If I were running a store on the West Coast, I couldn't get that kind of service out of it. But there are other publisher warehouses that are farther away. There are several in Indiana, some in Pennsylvania. Some houses are really, really good about filling orders fast, and others are really bad. The pandemic threw a lot of publishing operations for a loop, and some of them just haven't recovered fully. Mm-hmm. But I can also place an order and say, hey, this book is really taking off. I feel like it's going to be an important book for the season, and our sales reps will usually lean on the warehouse for us. That's one thing that the sales reps do that isn't necessarily visible to, I don't even think the editors know necessarily that the reps will do that, but they will call customer service up and say, please, this store can really do something with this book. Can you get their order out faster? So sometimes it's 2 days, sometimes it's 2 weeks. There's also Ingram Books, which is a national wholesaler. They have, I think, 4 major warehouses scattered around the country. They represent most publishers and have good stock on many, many books. So if I order from Ingram, I can usually get a book in a day or two, unless it's in a warehouse that's farther away, and then it might take a week. I don't get the same kind of discount from Ingram that I get from, say, Hachette or Penguin Random House, but their fulfillment is faster.
And with Ingram, would that be if I were a self-published cookbook author, I could have my book available through Ingram, so it would be easier for bookstores to carry it? Is that where you would get self-published books sometimes?
That's one path, sure. I don't know a great deal about exactly what sort of Ingram requires from authors, but there are a number of self-published authors who are sold through Ingram. Authors have choices in their relationship with Ingram about the kinds of deals that we get. And I will say that for anybody who's contemplating self-publishing, one thing to keep in mind is that independent bookstores usually expect a discount of 40% off the cover price. So, we want to pay $6 for a $10 book. If people choose to offer their book through Ingram at a lower discount, which they can do, we're less likely to carry it, because then the book may come with a printed price on it that we can't honor. And that makes us look not great, and it causes complications. And it's something to think about when you're self-publishing, that bookstores have margin expectations. And if you decide to go against them, the store is going to be less likely to go with you, or they'll price your book up in order to get the margin that they need.
It's just another layer of complexity when people want to self-publish a cookbook. It's not only the printing, it's the distribution, then it's the sales, and then these things that from the author end you never think about, the 40% discount. If you just marked your book differently, maybe it would be selling better through Ingram and those kinds of channels. So that's really good to know. I didn't know that.
There's a lot to know. And I say this about editors, but I think it wouldn't hurt for people who have long-term dreams of being an author, is that sometimes it's a really good thing to get a job in a bookstore. It astonishes me how many people who are making decisions at big publishing houses have never worked retail, who aren't there watching customers make the decisions. They don't watch people browse. They don't watch people open the book and say, you can see people sometimes flinch at page design.
Right.
Because if you can't read the page, particularly when there's a recipe involved,
right,
go into your local bookstore and watch people shop.
Yeah.
And you'll learn things about what they linger at, what causes, where they pay attention in books.
Can I ask you about that? One point Molly and I were talking about is that one of the challenges when it comes to putting the book design together is really picking that cover. And there's oftentimes the most contentious conversations are the cover. But I'm thinking if I'm in a physical bookstore, maybe that cover is only shown for when the book is out, and then it's going to be shelved, and the spine is going to be what draws people in. And no one ever talks about the spine. So can you talk a little bit just about cover design and how important is it really? And what other kinds of aspects of design should we be paying attention to?
You're absolutely right that the life of a book is probably going to be largely led through its spine. And so you want your spine to be incredibly easy to read. I mean, there was a trend very briefly for publishers to do books with a uncovered spine, so all you saw were the ends of the signatures. Terrible idea. Don't talk your publisher out of that if it comes up, because it's really hard to identify your book on the shelf. And you always want your book to be findable. You want it to be findable in somebody's home, and you also want it to be findable in stores. And most books spend their lives spine out.
Spine out, Molly.
A good spine. Let's say you as a customer walk into a bookstore. You've heard about this book that came out last year, and you go to the appropriate section and you start looking for it, and boom, you see the spine. And it's easy to read, and you're like, oh, look. So you've experienced minimal frustration just getting to the point of looking at the book. Whereas if the spine is really hard to read, and maybe it's got some interesting foil on a matte background, and the light is funky, and you can't tell what it says, by the time you found it, you're like, sorry. Yeah, a good spine is a really helpful thing. When it comes to front cover design, again, I think it's important to go to bookstores and browse and think about what people are seeing when they come in. A point that I make sometimes when people come here to talk about covers and about design is, you've walked into the store, there are 12,000 books here, and they're all competing for your attention. They're all saying, pick me, except you as an individual can't cope with that. So you're looking for something that communicates as clearly as possible what it is that you're after. And sometimes you may just be here for, a certain je ne sais quoi. You want something to surprise you and impress you and to get you out of a rut. But I think that a cover should communicate really clearly what the book is. Is it a soup book? There should be a really big bowl of soup on the cover. If it's a bunch of vegetables and a knife on a cutting board, that doesn't say soup. So type should be clean and easy to read. An author who's had 2 or 3 books, their name should be big, because people love to feel like they know an author. There's a real rapport that people start to develop when they've had a happy experience with a book, and they come back and it's like, oh, I love that book on phrasing, or I love that book on soup or salad or whatever. And so you give people that advantage of saying, hey, this is something that you have a reason to trust. I know that there is a lot of affection particularly in the food writing world, for some of the British style covers that are less literal. I feel like that may come from people who are not discovering books in bookstores and people who hear about books that they already know what they want rather than the act of browsing in a store. Because sometimes we get books in and the cover is literally beautiful, but it's still not telling you what you're getting. And as you're choosing from however many books are in that cookbook section, maybe it's not 12,000, but you're filtering, you're sorting, you're saying, maybe, no, okay, this is possible, this looks interesting. So I don't think there's anything wrong with selling your wares. There are some really lovely covers out there that are not literal, and some of them are quite effective. But in a lot of cases, you want to help people know that your book is what it's about.
Well said. What are types of things that authors can do to make your life easier? Because you talked a little bit about authors emailing you and saying, at least do a little research on knowing what your shop is capable of and that you're not a place for cooking demos. Are there other things? Because I would imagine certain times of the year are probably too busy. Like maybe it's not a good time in December to email you about a title that's coming out in February. Are there other things to just know that'll make it a little bit easier? Maybe like making a clear subject line saying author with a book coming out in February, or what do you think would help?
Those are all good things to keep in mind. Keep in mind also, too, that from the third week of September to the second week of November, something like 40% of all the cookbooks in the year will be released. So volunteering to come into the store and ask for a signing and attention, that's a really tough time. We're drowning in new releases and not really able to do anything out of the ordinary just because of the sheer volume. I think that's a mistake that the industry makes repeatedly. I would say that as a first-time author, you don't want to be published in the fall because you want to be published at a time when you're going to get the most attention possible.
Yeah, I've never heard that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now I think about it.
I mean, obviously, if you've written a Thanksgiving book, being published in the fall is a good thing.
Right.
But if you're writing a more general cookbook or a cookbook that isn't seasonally pinned, being out of that crush is important. I mean, I've had this conversation with a number of people who write cookbook review columns. And all of a sudden, they're writing for a newspaper and they've got 300 books to sort through to write a roundup of 10. So they have to be ruthless. You don't want the publicity people. You don't want the marketing people. You don't want anybody to have to be ruthless about your first book.
Right. The buyers, the reviewers, everybody.
Yeah. Give the book a chance at another time. Some people say, oh, you're never going to get the Christmas business if you're not out in the fall. But the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of things we recommend heavily through the fall that we got to know in March because we had the time to do it.
Right.
And we understand that, hey, this is a really sweet book. And it does this thing that we haven't seen anything else do for a while. And then we can hand sell it. We can talk to people about it. So I would strongly suggest that taking advantage of other times is a good thing. Asking a bookstore, whoever they are, if they'd be happy if you just come in to sign stuff. Sometimes, for a first-time author, that's as much of a commitment as you're going to get out of a store. Most stores are happy to have you sign stock. There is a truism that circulates that signed books cannot be returned to publishers. This is not the truth.
Right. I was going to ask you about
we were going to clarify that. Yep.
Yes. Yes.
Publishers do not go through the returns warehouse opening each book to see if the author signed it. So it's not a guarantee that your book won't be returned. But it is a way of getting yourself into the bookstore, introduced to the staff in a low-stress situation. They're like, oh, this author came in and this author was friendly. They were helpful. They didn't demand a big drama. Maybe they posted it on Instagram. They have 500 followers, most of whom are in our town, but that's great. That's great for the bookstore. I mean, if you've got a totally local audience and you've gone to your local bookstore, you've done them a big favor, and they can be very happy with that. But just watch how they promote, watch what they do. Don't try to assume that you can remake their whole marketing philosophy on behalf of your sole book.
So the seasonal thing is very interesting. But so let's say your book came out in the fall, you're a first-time author, and your publisher that's what they wanted to do, and they did it. And it got lost because there are 300 other titles competing for it. But you still believe in this book, and the new year comes around. What about coming in February or March and saying, hey, my book came out in the fall, approaching at that point and sort of seeing if you can't breathe a little life into something?
I think that's a great idea. As long as you're not showing up with saying, let's have a party in your store.
No, let's sign a few. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. January for us is a really depressing month because publishers apparently only believe that people buy weight loss books in January. There are almost no new releases for us in January.
And dry NA drink books.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a profound lack of imagination on their part. And even February and March, it's kind of slow. And so I think those are nice times to be reaching out to an indie store, and because trying to juice it up, they don't have a lot of pressure and they can be happy to sort of put a sign on a stack of books that says signed copy, and things seem fresh. Because, as a retailer, I don't want to train people not to come to my store at certain times of the year. I want them coming in. I want them finding interesting books. And even just sort of suddenly have this stack of books that says it's signed, and it wasn't that way when somebody was here 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. That's a benefit.
When does a book turn into backlist? Is it after it's out? It's the front list when it's in the catalog, fall releases. And then as soon as, say, January 1 rolls around the new year, is it now considered a backlist title?
It depends on the publisher. Some publishers define backlist as anything that's been out more than 60 days. It also depends on promotions. That we may get, say, an offer of extra discount if we order 50 combined backlist titles, and they'll say, okay, that's anything that's been out more than 2 months. There are various points in the year when publishers try to sort of wake things up a little bit. They do that sometimes with front list books as well. They may have an offer that says there are 10 cookbooks on this list. If you buy 3 copies of any 4 of them, you'll get an extra 2 points of discount. Trying to get stores to be adventurous. Usually, if we're interested in the book, we're going to be ordering more than 3 copies anyway. So for us, it's an easy mark to hit. But the fact that they said it there says that 3 is better than 2, so 2 may be a common front list order for a lot of stores.
And you mentioned returns before, and so you get a book in and it's not moving, or you order too many, you're overly optimistic about it. And just to manage your own inventory, obviously you can't keep everything there. So, that decision to return books, just curious about how that all works.
It depends slightly on the publisher. Some of the smaller presses have tighter time limits. And understandably, they're not interested in thinking that they've sold 10,000 copies of a book only to find out 2 years later that it was really 6. But for the most part, we don't have to worry about that kind of thing. I make the biggest sort of sweep through the store looking at returns in January. There's less material coming in. There are some bills that are going to have to be paid soon. So I'm thinking to myself, well, how can I reduce those bills? And I will hold a book longer, even if it has not been selling really strongly, if it's in an area where there aren't a lot of other alternatives. If I had the Portuguese baking book, and even if it hadn't sold quite as well as I thought it would, I would probably not return all the copies, because I'm like, how could I not have a Portuguese baking book when there's one in the world? But conversely, that year of all the pie books, I was pretty harsh on the pie books when the time came, and I cut inventory down heavily. I don't think I got rid of anything totally, but I pushed the inventory down. There are books that I sometimes carry because I see them as a souvenir rather than a book that people will use. So books that they come out, they have this big burst of attention because people love the author, and then it pretty much dies. And so we don't keep those around very long. To use an example of The Safely Dead, it was that way with the Two Fat Ladies books. Do you remember that old British TV series?
Yep.
A new book would come out, it would be boom, and then it would die. Because I don't think people were actually cooking from that book. They just loved watching the show. And then they would be like, oh, yeah. And they'd go back to watching the show. And the books weren't, people gave the books because you knew somebody who loved the show, so you gave them the book. But it's more likely with many books that we're going to just go to the publisher one day and discover that we can't get it anymore than it is that we're going to cut it off. It breaks my heart sometimes to go and reorder something and it's like, no, it's gone. Or it's in that dreaded out of stock indefinitely.
Right. Breaks our heart a little bit too. But that's actually really positive to hear that you're reluctant to return things. It's more about hoping that you can keep a title in the store for a long life.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of books here that we sell 1 copy every other year, and plenty of books that we might sell 2 copies of in a year. And sometimes that book that sells, we sell 1 copy every 6 months, sells all by itself. Or sometimes it comes in and somebody will buy 15 books, and 6 of them will be things that we only sell once a year. So we've done really nicely by them by giving them a selection they didn't know that they wanted. We've sold a much bigger ticket because we've had this pile of books. So we want people to look at our California regional section and say, look at all these restaurants. I had no idea. This is amazing. I see something about the American restaurant community because there are all these California restaurant books. And I'm sure most of them sell more strongly in California than they do here, just like the Southern cookbooks sell more strongly in the South than they do here. But we want to be sure that we offer people a kind of a touchstone of those areas in which they get a sense of what's going on and what's interesting and who should I be paying attention to.
So interesting. I feel like I'm just sitting here listening and learning so much.
Me too.
You've been generous with your time. We don't want to take up too much more of it. But just before we go, Matt, given that a lot of our listeners are aspiring cookbook authors, maybe you could tell us what types of books you're hoping to see more of in the future, in addition to Portuguese baking books.
We're going to be flooded now. I have a Portuguese baking proposal.
I would be happy to see a couple of Portuguese baking books thrive. Portugal's having an up moment, so I think that
for sure.
Could be a good time. Generally speaking, people should be writing out of a depth of knowledge, or at least out of a growing passion. So if you haven't been immersed in Portuguese baking for a long time, maybe don't go run and do that. But there are all kinds of regional books that are very poorly represented in American publishing. Central America, for instance, is really not distinctly covered. There's some good material, really good material in a couple of general books, but I could not put a book in your hands on the food of Costa Rica, even though lots of Americans go there and they have a good time and they come back and they're happy and they talk about good food. So those kinds of examples are important. There's a lot to be said also about the rest of South America. A couple of Peruvian books, a couple of Brazilian books around. There was a nice Colombian book a year or two ago, but all of Colombia cannot be contained in a single book. And same way with Chile and Argentina. So there's a lot of territory there, and they don't have to be baking books, but maybe one could. I think Africa is also still so poorly represented here. There have been increasing efforts to represent Africa, and I'm really glad to see that happening, but vast place, so culturally diverse, so geographically deserved, and the climate, all of that is so different. I think it's still possible to take on areas that are well covered before and to do them with depth and with passion. And there are funny things like if you came into the store and said, I just inherited a castle in the Loire Valley of France. I would like a book about the food of the Loire. I mean, that's a happy story, but there are no books in English on the food of the Loire.
Really? Wow.
There have been, but they're not around. There are parts of Italy that are not well represented. And it's really worth spending time in a bookstore and seeing what's out there. But as always, come at it willing to go deep. Come at it willing to treat your readers' interests seriously. Don't feel like you have to invent something that isn't there. But if you understand something about an ingredient or a tradition a little differently than other people, that's great to talk about it. I think that books that are written because of a powerful internal logic rather than because they tick boxes on a checklist or fit to an algorithm are almost always going to be the ones that end up sticking with people and becoming the kinds of books that people pass to a friend and say, I loved it. Mm-hmm. And you have explored at various points in the podcast, cookbook publishing and writing is not always necessarily powerfully lucrative, but there are other satisfactions to be gotten from it, and contributing to other people's enjoyment, contributing to other people's a richer, broader world is incredibly worthy. And it's a really beautiful thing you can do for somebody. And I would say that's so worthwhile. And if you conceive of a project that makes you feel like that's what you'll be doing, then run with it.
Wow. Those are amazing closing words. I think I'll go back and listen to this podcast a few times when I'm feeling like I need a little bit more inspiration to keep going.
Yeah, likewise. No, that was great. Thank you so much, Matt, for sharing all of that with us.
Definitely my pleasure. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio, and if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really helps people find the show. Thank you, as always, to our amazing editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.